Welcome. Welcome to the realm of ideas free to all. This is episode number 12. It is called My Past Architecture. It basically deals with my formative circumstance from when I was a little boy to when I went to architectural school. So, how we kind of got from the very beginning, the roots, the interests, and how they led me down a certain path. This is a series of ruminations I'm putting together for a project, maybe a book, maybe just a series of letters or whatever. But it was something I had kind of initiated or had been initiated with another individual. And then once we did, and then I kind of felt that I was better off kind of on my own. So as a result, this is where we are. This is episode number 12. Brief recap is that started out with talking about the operation of the metaphor. This was something I felt in my studies became a generative strategy for the way in which I go about making the work that I do. It was a good start to kind of look at the fact that this was a kind of key idea. I'm starting to start with kind of key ideas and work from there. Next thing I did from there was talk about its situation, what I believe it is, and how I believe it came to be important, and emphasize its nature in relationship to what I do and what it is itself. Then from there, um, spoke about criticism. The 3 episodes, what about the metaphor was the organic metaphor, the artificial and static metaphor, and then unbreakable bonds or the proto metaphor, in which I talked about the idea of it as a kind of societal indicator, which is something we'll talk about in later times. Then we talked about criticism, the art of finding what needs to be said, and then criticism as an indicator of societal health. From there, we went more away from the kind of abstract philosophical and kind of talked more about the relationship of myself to architecture, established the idea that I felt that architecture was best viewed in the way in which I go about it as a verb, not a noun, as an action, as an activity, as a process, not as a series of objects. Objects kind of could be repositories, kind of memories, or kind of facsimiles. But the best way to think about architecture was to think about the architecture of the process of the kind of activity of it as a thing. And then from there, we talked about drawing as a kind of extension and illustration of that process of the verb, as well as kind of an illustrator of the process of the metaphor in which people make work. And then towards an organic architecture, which was my basic goal, which I've been working on probably since well, not when I was in school. I was conscious of ideas of it. I think I came to become conscious of the idea of the metaphor through the work of Ortega Gasset, and kind of like started to see it was kind of missing as an operation in architecture. So I kind of started to go in a separate direction. Anyway, so last week we talked about authority of ideas, thoughts as regards this as an indicator of societal health as well. So that's it. Like I said, the concept of unbreakable bonds is the fact that over time, certain things come together as these kind of proto metaphors, or kind of like societal kind of buttresses. Things come together and they kind of meld and kind of come in kind of networks, and they start to demonstrate a certain utility. As a result of that happening, we start to be able to kind of see the fact that in other times we may have believed something, now we believe something else because it's more effective. This is a process that goes on throughout history. It's the idea of kind of like illustrating the difference between the abstract thought and the actual things that we observe. Over the course of these lectures, I've talked about different people who were specific influences to me, and like how they kind of came to kind of help shape my thinking. Okay, so last week we talked about the fact that there was a kind of like subversion of a certain unbreakable bond. Now, by an unbreakable bond, again, we don't mean that it can't be dismantled, but that it has a consequence that we've come to see, and that unbreakability comes from the fact of its utility and its essential nature and its need to kind of be maintained until it can be supplanted by something better. So that was that. And now we come to going through a kind of autobiographical period of, walking myself through those ruminations that kind of got me to the place that I'm at now. Okay, so my past architecture formative circumstance. I was born in Queens Village in New York City, 1959, April 13th. Middle-class family, immigrants from Scotland. Nothing really of any extraordinary circumstance to report in terms of that. Somewhat of a kind of anti-intellectual, dysfunctional family. Nothing horribly, overwhelmingly abusive, but just a kind of like circumstance of not the kind of place that encouraged ambition or encouraged success. It was a kind of a feral, tribal, kind of fearful, superstitious-based place where anyone who attempted to leave or anyone who attempted to kind of better themselves was instantly kind of like put upon and tried to be brought down to kind of have, to abandon such ambitions. So it wasn't a support. It was never a supportive environment, but at the same time, because of the kind of lack of, cohesion among its people, it was, and it was not really very well organized. It was actually very lazy and very non-committed. So there were ways to kind of learn how to kind of deceive and move between the places to kind of get yourself some stealth. So anyway, enjoyed fascination with the environment around me. Enjoyed objects, enjoyed kind of like playing blocks. One of the things I remember was the window on my mother's front door had a light panel, and this light panel kind of set a light object that kind of moved across the living room floor as the course of the day. So I used to, play in the sun in that little light box, this little moving polygon that would kind of move across the floor. And as a result, it would kind of like become a great place for me to kind of situate my blocks. I would watch how the shadows would lengthen. I would, create distances. And I could use that to kind of space my blocks. And I remember one day, at the end of the day, after, several hours of kind of playing blocks, I looked back across the floor and had seen how I had taken the blocks as they moved. And I had kind of created this kind of trail as I moved them across the floor, leaving some behind, and then kind of adding and then moving and then adding and moving. And then eventually kind of like went from my starting point to my end point and kind of had this very interesting organizing structure that had kind of moved itself as a result of following the path of the light that was kind of given through this opening in the door. Backyard was a kind of a grass and had a few little areas where you could kind of see some natural things. I remember one incredibly poignant time was watching a praying mantis that had been attacked by a swarm of bees or hornets, and they had actually kind of started to devour it literally. And I remember watching this, kind of fascinated by the fact that they had eaten into the abdomen to the point where the mantis was still alive, but they had actually kind of like broken the exoskeleton and kind of could crawl inside the abdomen of the mantis. At a certain point, I think my mother saw this, was terrified by it, and kind of killed the mantis, and then basically dispersed all the insects. I remember kind of being somewhat excited and interested by certain motions and movements. And we had a globe that I think I remember looking at and watching television. Was a great fan of Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny was my hero. I later really, kind of saw him as this kind of person who I could identify as. He was going to go his own way, do his own thing. It was, that all he wanted to do was be left to himself, which I completely identified with. Which eventually would become a problem when people would ask me to go things like schools and churches and institutional organizations that I had no interest in, because I was basically like, hey, if you leave me alone, I'll play with my blocks, I'll make my drawings, I'll make my sketches and scribbles, and you just don't concern yourself with me. And I started to understand the fact that these organizations that I was asked to participate in were more kind of societal, obligational than any real interest in the fact that there would be any benefit to me. Anyway, one place that I do remember this was a very kind of important place, was there was a public library in Queens Village. And Queens Village, I think the building was a fairly new building. I think it was built in 1955. I was born in 1959. Anyway, on Fridays, they had a reading group, which, was kind of they didn't really have nursery school in those days, but they wanted to kind of get children to be somewhat socialized before they would go off to kindergarten. So I remember my parents bringing me to, my mother used to walk me there from our house. And it was where we first was introduced to libraries, which was something I fell in love with and have never looked back. Libraries are probably libraries and museums are probably my greatest places where I feel most at home, feel most comfortable. I remember telling someone that the only places that I ever felt that I belonged was either the lecture hall or the studio. And I would include in that like museums and libraries. The rest of the world doesn't really make sense to me. But those were places where I always felt very, very happy, very, very content, very, very satisfied. My natural adventurous spirit kind of found satisfaction there. So anyway, we would be brought here on a Friday, and we would sit in a circle, and someone would read, and I would kind of like found that I could kind of gradually move myself slowly towards the stacks, because I kind of had seen, all these stacks of books arranged in this kind of labyrinth of these kind of like rows of intersecting kind of streets and alleys and pathways. So I was kind of drawn to that because inside it, my house didn't have a lot of books, but the few books that they had, fortunately, my father had been in the British Army and participated in the Second World War. Actually was in the Normandy invasion, as well as was in the liberating force at Bergen-Belsen. So he had books of his regiment and also books with maps. So I used to love to look because I could see the shapes, I could see the pictures, understand that there were oceans and there were lands and there were capitals and there were properties and there were boundaries and borders and there were arrows to indicate motions and things like that. So the first books that I think I saw were military books, or atlases, and they were kind of fun for me because they kind of like you didn't really need to read. I think the first word that I learned was north. I think the first word that I said was north, because it was like the arrow was the indicator, and like kind of I remember pointing and it was north. So it's like, I think north was the first word that I ever said. Anyway, so we go to the library, and I remember I would inch myself and start myself towards these things, and I would gradually get inside. And then I kind of remember once you kind of got in the stacks, you could kind of disappear. And since no one was really paying close attention, it was usually like, it was not a very big building. It was a big enough building that I say, there was like the reading group and maybe a handful of people. I think there were 2 or 3 librarians. Anyway, it was not the kind of thing where you really had to worry about, you know, anything going wrong. I think, I was, and what I came to learn that, I was always very well supervised. Once I got into the stacks and I was kind of separated from the herd, I found that there was, this ability now to kind of engage in this uh, super, this kind of like this wonderful, magnificent uh, forest with all these branching kind of shelves of these kind of like fruits and vegetables and things hanging down that could kind of be taken out. Some had, cellophane jackets, some had no jackets, some had like paper jackets, but they were all different kinds. And there were some words in some books that just had all words, and there were some books that had pictures. But I remember, I tried to look for things that resembled the books I had in my house. And I think maybe because of that, um, I came across a book that seemed to be very interesting because I could see on the cover um, there were diagrams of people and birds and things. And then it was this big book. And I think I remember it kind of being like a leather cover, like a leather colored cover with a hard cover. And I remember at one point it was on a very low shelf, so I could kind of pull it down. Now the size of this book was pretty big, and I'm maybe before kindergarten. I'm probably 3 or 4 years old. So anyway, I remember seeing this and kind of bringing it down and putting it on the floor and opening it, and it was kind of like almost like rest. It was almost like a treasure chest. It was so big relative to me that I kind of wrestled it to the ground and it stood it up and then laid it down on its back and then opened it up, and it was like opening up the the the, the lid of a treasure chest and looking inside. I kind of almost remember it kind of like as if the pages glowed out in the kind of like resonation of like what it had in store. So it almost kind of seemed as if it was magical. And I just kind of looked at this and I saw all these. There were words and there were pictures, and there were diagrams and all kinds of different things. I didn't understand the language because I didn't speak yet. Couldn't read. So you could see it was kind of script type lettering. It wasn't, single individual letters. And anyway, as a result, I kind of came to see this as something of great interest to me. Remember just kind of sitting there, just on the floor that one day, and then I think someone kind of found me, not exactly who sure found me that first day, but they kind of like kind of like just gently kind of, so it's time to go. Took the book, put it back on the shelf, and then we kind of said goodbye and we went. And I don't know if I was chastised for kind of moving away from the group, but I don't. If it was, it wasn't a tremendous shock to anyone. It was kind of like we can all look over each other. We could kind of like see what was going on. It's interesting. I don't know what it would be like today. I mean, so it was just allowed that people had this sense of we weren't so paranoid. We weren't so, kind of dictatorial about how we conducted ourselves or how we conducted ourselves with our children. Anyway, as time went on, I found that I would kind of go directly to the stacks and try to get the book. And this was when I kind of met my first friend. Um, I've had many friends who were librarians. I love librarians. Uh, and I think that this is probably the reason. There was a woman, I believe her name was Mrs. Rosen. I'm not exactly 100% sure, but I do remember she wore a Jewish cross, so Star of David, so I'm assuming she was Jewish, but I think her name was Rosen, but she was one of the librarians, and she had noticed that that I had kind of shown an interest in this book. And then what she would do is she would take it down from because I think it belonged on a higher shelf. or she would kind of take it down for me. And, she would actually, what would happen was she would sit with me and kind of just watch me and kind of look after me and kind of, because and I think to me, it was a great lesson, because the lesson was there are things you're supposed to do and you do have responsibility and obligations. But if you do find something of your own that's of consequence, we'll engage that. So Mrs. Rosen would actually kind of sometimes wait to see me, and then we would kind of sit down. And I remember, sometimes I would talk to her, and we kind of started to kind of have a conversation. And that's when I realized that the individual who this book was about was Leonardo da Vinci. And I came to kind of understand that this was a man who dedicated his life to trying to understand the things around me, and that was kind of something that I said, that makes sense. Isn't that what everyone does? So for me, it was like, okay, where's everyone else's monograph of their discoveries, of their ruminations? But, this was something that was a prized possession. Actually, interestingly, Julie found this for me. I believe this is, I think, the same book that I had gotten, which was, the book that I loved one. That this was that book. And I remember, I think the difference on the cover was there were all kinds of diagrams and drawings and a kind of compilation, but I mean, that was what originally drew it to me.
It's a miraculous book.
This one comes with a cover. Yeah. But I mean, I do believe that it was a book like this. I remember it being this big and this cumbersome, and this, like I said, it seemed more like a treasure chest than a book. It seemed like as if it was a kind of like a book of wonders that one could kind of engage in. I kind of, when I found this book, I found it at the Strand. Julie found it at the Strand for me. And when I got it, I kind of like felt like it was that somebody had kind of found Mrs. Rosen, and Mrs. Rosen had kind of passed along this kind of beautiful object for me to keep. I remember one time, I remember when I realized I got a library card of my own and I was now able to take out books. I remember asking Mrs. Rosen if it was possible if I could take out this book. And she said certain books were not able to be removed from the library premises. And I remember, I'm just going to hold this with me. Certain books could not be removed from the premises. And in a way I was sad, but in a way I was happy, because I realized there were certain precious things that really as much as we, want to trust everyone, there are certain things we need to kind of hold with a certain esteem and a certain safety from each other. So I remember kind of always knowing that whenever I needed or wherever I wanted, I could always go back and kind of sit with Mrs. Rosen. We could kind of open the pages and look at the drawings and talk about, what we'd seen and what we'd understood. One of the things I remember was the notebooks. That the notebooks were something that kind of seemed to kind of illustrate his desire to understand things, and they kind of seemed to kind of make these kind of very, intricate, detailed drawings. I feel as if Leonardo's drawings were the way in which everyone should draw, and everyone should draw. I also like the fact I felt special when I found out that Leonardo was left-handed, and I myself was left-handed. I kind of felt there was a kind of special kinship there, which kind of really kind of made me feel as if I'd kind of found, a friend. So for me, after Bugs Bunny, kind of Leonardo became my next hero. So I needed to get notebooks, and I needed to start to get out there and start to kind of like, draw on the things that I saw. So, and also kind of illustrate the ideas of how the mechanisms worked. So this was my first real introduction to architecture. I'd had my kind of ruminations and my kind of manipulations of organization of blocks. But now I actually kind of, saw the idea of kind of manipulations and mechanisms and, other kind of things. So for me, I didn't know what the word architecture was. I hadn't really come across it. I still didn't read, but I kind of like understood that this pursuit that Leonardo engaged in was going to be what I was going to do. And I kind of thought like, well, I don't remember telling my mom, say, I don't need to go to school now because I already know what I want to do. So I can just go out into the world and do that. And unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. Like I said, well, you have to go to school, get a job, and do things, and blah, blah, blah. I was like, wow, it's complicated. But anyway, that was the kind of like, it was that, they'll never forget the fact that like Mrs. Rosen looked after me. She looked over me and kind of nurtured me in ways that other people didn't, to kind of, make me feel as if it was okay to be, that eager, curious, adventurous mind who just wanted to look upon these things and kind of engage in understanding. And I think one of the main rules, the main objectives I learned from Leonardo was that it was all about trying to understand. And, that was a passion, that for him, whatever his feelings about why he needed to do it, he needed to do it. So anyway, I kind of remember kind of thinking I needed to have notebooks. So I told my mom, I said, like, I need to have notebooks. And she said, well, you have your coloring books. And like, that's what you have as a boy. Boys have coloring books and then they go to school and then they get notebooks when they go to school. So I said, okay, fine. Well, can I have them earlier? And she said, no. So when you go to kindergarten, again, I thought, great, I'll go get notebooks. You don't get notebooks because you don't have lessons. And I was like, okay. So what I did was, in the years until I went to first grade, I, used to, kind of take my coloring books, and I tried to take my crayons, and I kind of tried to draw the things. And I would always draw on the pages that had the least outlines, so they could kind of like not obscure my own drawings of what I was trying to see. They're very crude, very rudimentary because I didn't know what I was doing. But I did try to kind of look at things and observe. And finally, I got to first grade. I was allowed to go coloring books. One of the things that was sad was that once I went to kindergarten, I, asked if I could go back to the library, and they kind of said, no, that's only for preschool kids, or whatever the reason was. But I couldn't go back. So I missed going and seeing Mrs. Rose, and I kind of had a library card. I said, but I have a library card. I want to use my library card. And we never found the time to get back to the library as much as I would like. So anyway, I was now going to kindergarten in first grade. First grade, we had lessons so we could have notebooks. So I kind of was given these kind of black and white kind of school notebooks, the ones that are like Scholastic, or what are they? They're like black and white with that marbled pattern on it. So I remember kind of having that, and that was great. And then, I kind of kept them in my desk. And what I would do was, I took mine out to recess. Now, we're supposed to have one for your spelling and one for writing and one for math, like, arithmetic and things like that. But, I was just like, I'm not going to, I would do that. But I mean, I also needed to kind of do my own investigations. I had waited patiently now. It was 5 or 6 years old. And I, wanted to kind of go back to, being Leonardo. I remember I would go out and I would kind of look around the things. We had a really beautiful playground behind the school, and it was like a railroad track on one side, and there was a big fence, and there was a big parking lot on the other side, and then there was like all these other worlds. But this grassy, big, fairly big place, which was a place I kind of grew to love, was a place where I could investigate. I could run around and find things. And, there wasn't a lot of supervision, because, it wasn't like we could wander off and get hurt. So, you kind of had to recess, and it was kind of pretty much unstructured, which was great. So I would kind of take my notebooks and I would go out there and I'd try to kind of, demonstrate things. I remember one day, it was a kind of a great time. I was kind of running around and kind of just having fun. And I remember this dragonfly kind of had come, and we kind of almost ran into each other. At a certain point, we kind of came eye to eye, this like 5 or 6 year old boy and this dragonfly. And I remember he was very big, and I believe he was brown and black. And like, we stopped, and I kind of believe it's like we looked at each other, and he's kind of looked at me with this kind of like, kid, what are you doing? I almost ran into you. And I was like, oh, I'm really sorry. I think I even said it. It's like, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just kind of enjoying myself and running around and like, and then he kind of backed up and went like that. And I thought to myself, that's amazing. I also remembered that I'd seen in Leonardo's books his drawings of the birds and the drawings of the flying machine. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, you know, if you're going to use a model for flying, why are you using birds? This insect is a much better flyer. I think that if you're going to make a flying machine, you should study the insects because they fly better than the birds. And to me, this was like a major revelation. I was excited. So I ran back into the school. I remember after recess was over, and we came in, and sometimes we would talk about, we had show and tell was something that we did, and I kind of never really interested in that, but I thought, okay, it's the show and tell moment. Here's my idea. Like, I figured out what I think is an important thing, and it was like the idea of like Leonardo was a brilliant man, but he didn't understand that that dragonflies are better flyers, and insects in general are better flyers than birds. He should have used the insect model instead of the bird model, and he would have been able to succeed. And I now had a project to do. I was going to do that, and I was going to make my flying machine, and I was going to prove, hey, look, it is possible to fly. You just need to have the right mechanism. Now, we still haven't figured it out, though the wingsuit is pretty cool. I've seen people make these gliders, and I love paper airplanes. And I mean, I actually met, what's his name? John, the paper airplane guy who had the record. What's his name? Anyway, I met him we were at a maker fair, and his booth was next to mine. And I remember him kind of like, and I had kind of made a variation of mine, which was instead of the 8.5 by 11 sheet in the kind of long direction, I put it in the short direction. So I had a wider glider, which he thought was interesting. I think I even gave him a copy of it. But I remember, I think he signed a copy of his book. He gave me a copy of his book, and he signed it for me, which I thought was cool. What was his name? He's famous. You look him up. He's a world record. He held the world record for paper airplane design because he didn't throw it, because he actually had somebody, he kind of had a quarterback for a college guy who actually could throw it, and they broke the world record. It was really cool. I think he was a California guy, but he made the rounds in the maker fairs in kind of science circuit. It's pretty cool. He was a really nice man. Anyway, so now I come in, hey, this is the thing. And I remember, rather than there being excitement, there was this kind of like snickering and kind of like, oh my God. And there was like laughter and like kind of like, oh, what an idiot. And like, teacher got very angry. And I remember her kind of saying like, I was going to show her my notebook because I'd done a drawing of like what a dragonfly looks like with the 4 wings and the head. It wasn't a very good drawing, but I was kind of made a diagram of like it could move forward and backwards and up and down. And as a bird kind of like swim in the air, this one actually kind of like seemed to kind of hang in the air. And before I got the drawing out, she grabbed the notebook and took it away from me. And then she kind of like went to my desk and opened up my desk and looked and saw the fact that I had been kind of, making drawings and diagrams and scribbling in my notebooks rather than keeping my lessons. So she confiscated my notebooks, and she called my mother and told her what I was doing, and my mother confiscated my notebooks at home. So this was a clear indication that, again, these public institutions were not there to kind of concern themselves with what was of interest to me. They had an obligation and a responsibility, though society kind of, had a right and an interest in making sure that people were educated. But at the same time, the system seemed to not be taking into account the desires of the individual. Now, around this same time, I remember it was like, this was the time of Sputnik, and the United States, was testing everyone. And I remember kind of getting the test, and remember the IQ people kind of like gave me the test 2 or 3 times. I remember there was an individual who came and asked me a question about some of the questions that I had gotten wrong. And he kind of said, like, when they were number sequence questions, I remember. And he said, like, why did you pick these answers? This is obviously the right answer. And I said, well, there was like 4 or 5 questions where there was more than one answer. And he said, none of them have more than one answer. I said, no, some of them had more than one answer, but I picked the simpler answer. And he kind of like showed me, he goes, well, where is that? And I kind of said, well, this is this, and then this. He said, oh shit, And there was like, I remember there was 5. He found 3. But anyway, I remember kind of like that was kind of something where, actually, I wear my, let's see, it's funny, Genius t-shirt. But I remember thinking that I kind of knew what I wanted to do. And it seems as if the things that were interesting to me weren't of interest to anyone else, and no one seemed to be concerned with what was of value to me, nor thinking that, based on what Bruce's value and desires were, let's try to interest him in kind of thinking, hey, here are the things that might be valuable to you in order for you to kind of deepen your interest in finding things. I mean, just the same way that, Leonardo was self-taught, I felt that, like, I wanted to teach myself to draw. And I mean, probably would have needed to kind of teach myself, basic science and math. But again, because science and math was taught so poorly, I mean, I remember thinking that, these things were very simple. I loved puzzles. I remember, again, these kind of things of organizational patterns and kind of like structures and things like that always fascinated me. I loved puzzles. I remember one summer, I think I was like 3rd or 4th grade. I had a friend who used to he built models, the kind of ship and plane and car models. And I would love to kind of go over his house and like look at the things they did. I love the intricacy of it. And he had this book, then I took it down, and I was kind of like looking at some of them and looking at the rules, and it's like, oh, if you do this and this and this, and then it asked questions. I said, oh, I thought it was a puzzle book. And I said, hey, Douglas, can I borrow this book? He said, yeah. Douglas is older than me. He was like a teenager. I was like 3rd, 4th grade. I think he was like 14 or something like that. But I just was drawn to him because he loved to play. He loved to build these beautiful models. My father had occasionally dabbled in models, but he didn't have the patience that Douglas had. Douglas could sit there for hours and kind of make sure everything was perfect, and he would sand and shave, because a lot of these things were kind of, die cast in plastic, and they kind of didn't always fit perfectly, and he would kind of shave and make sure everything fit. I loved watching him. I mean, I knew with my little hands I just couldn't work with that precision, but I was hoping that one day I'd be able to kind of make things. And again, this was an extension of the things I had seen in Leonardo, of the idea of kind of figuring these things out. And there were all these things I had seen in the book, these mechanisms, these machines that he would make, and they were so beautiful. I said, I want to make these things. Anyway, so now in terms of the world, I still don't know what an architect is, but anyway, I kind of took this book home and kind of had over the summer, and remember coming back and said, like, kind of writing down all the answers. And I said, like, this is a great puzzle book. Do you have any more puzzle books? He goes, like, that's not a puzzle book. That's algebra. So I kind of taught myself algebra over the summer, and it was like algebra or pre-algebra. Again, I'm in 3rd or 4th grade. But I loved that. I just loved knowing the rules and then figuring out what you had to do to solve the problems. And it was funny because here I had kind of taught myself algebra as an 8 or 9 year old boy. And then I remember when I took algebra, I think it was in 7th grade, the way they taught it was so bad. I couldn't follow them. I couldn't follow the way they interpreted the rules based on the way I had kind of understood the rules. I kind of like, this is this and this is that. That means this and this, and when this happens, you do this. And it just seemed as if it gotten all confused for me. And I just kind of found it, very unfun. The way they kind of presented it to me was not very fun. So I remember not doing very well in that. So, at the same time, these were the things that kind of like were starting to make me understand that, like, as much as there was a lot of opportunity because there was a lot of excitement going on in the world, you know, it wasn't like anyone was going out of their way to kind of concern themselves with what was of interest to you. So, but again, this is the 1960s in America. Now, the World's Fair is in Queens, in my backyard. Now, unfortunately, I was never taken there as much as I really wanted to go. You know, it was something that my family didn't see as important. I remember some of my friends, all my friends, got to go. They'd say, "Hey, can I go with them?" But it was almost as if they kind of wanted to keep me away from it, which was really weird. But I mean, again, it's not important what that was. It was. But I got the lessons, and I saw the postcards, and I saw all the kind of things about it. And I heard about it. It was on the news all the time. So I might as well have been there. It was unfortunate that I never got a chance to actually be on the grounds in Flushing Meadow, but I knew about it because that was what I grew up in. So again, this is around the time, I'm going to the public library, and I'm kind of like starting to kind of read, and, learning about Leonardo, who seemed to me like he had these same ideas of rocket ships and parachutes and all kinds of things. So this was my world. Now, also, like a couple of years later, when I'm 10 years old, Neil Armstrong walks on the moon. And I remember, like, there was a speech that JFK gave, I think 1963, 1964, at Rice University. The famous, like, we don't go there because it's easy, we go there because it's hard. And it was one of those things that was just exciting. I didn't understand it at the time because I was just a boy, but I do remember that for me, regardless of the fact that no one was kind of coming to kind of help me further my, I got the sense like, okay, people don't help you on what's important to you. You have responsibilities and obligations. You have to fulfill them. You have to do what you're told. But at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of excitement in the world and a lot of opportunities. I didn't really know necessarily how to get to those opportunities. I just assumed that, I would figure that out. I don't think I ever did. And I think that was part of the problem, is that the country didn't figure out either. So 1969, we have 1964, 1963, we have JFK, we have the World's Fair, we have Neil Armstrong. Also, on top of that, in Queens, I have the Jets and the Mets. I remember, like, the Mets were like this ragtag team that no one took seriously, and they were kind of like competing against, actually, ironically, the Baltimore Orioles, which were a power team. And I remember the thing is, the bigger one for me was the New York Jets. And they had Joe Namath, who was like, again, this was like the AFL. They weren't a serious league. Nobody really cared. And here's this brash, arrogant guy who comes out and says, we're going to be, we're going to the Super. They win the Super. They barely got to the Super Bowl, but they get there. And they said, we're not going to get destroyed. We're going to win this. So in this little short period of time, I see the World's Fairs in Queens. World champion baseball's Queens. World champion football's Queens, right? Neil Armstrong walks the moon. So for me, I understand this idea is that the horizon of ideas, for me, is limitless. So I'm seeing flying cars and spaceships and space stations and robots and all kinds of things, and the house of the future, the toaster of the future, the TV, all these new things to kind of engage for expansion and adventure. This is before I'm 10 years old. I'm thinking, I remember the day I walked into the playground after watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. I kind of like, ran out to the playground and pronounced. I climbed to the top of the jumbo jet and said, "Hey, just so you know, I'm going to be the first person to walk on Mars." And a rumble broke out because everyone said, "No, it's going to be me." Now, the great thing about that was the ambition. That was the horizon of dreams of a working class kid in Queens. No royalty, no aristocracy, no special privilege, but just like Neil Armstrong, a person who wanted it really badly, who worked really hard, could do that, could be the person who kind of like would go to the farthest reaches. So for me, that was what I expected in my life. Now, unfortunately, um, that wasn't that wasn't the goal of my nation. America lost its nerve, and it never really regained it. And I kind of looked upon that cowardice as a betrayal of what our ambitions were. America failed us. And I think, between the people who came after Johnson and Nixon, Carter, right? You know, the world changed and the complexion was different. So my belief was I was going to uh, live my life in space. I was going to kind of like be the first person on Mars. And then basically the next thing after that was be on a space probe that would go into deep space. That was where basically I assumed I would come up to meet my end. So imagine I kind of thought the fact that, I would meet my end as in a space probe directed in the opposite direction from where I had been born. So I had kind of had this point of origin, which was basically zero, and I was just going as far as and that was what people would do. We would just be jettisoned back into the stardust from which we came. I love that. I thought that's how I want my life to end, by going back into that from which I came. Now, I was given the idea of an alternative solution, which was that of the Cold War, which was that at any minute, that deep space kind of annihilation, rather that gentle sleep into oblivion, moving back towards the origin of the Big Bang, was now that moment where you would hear like nothing, and you would just be vaporized in a second of light. Now, there's a beauty in that too. I kind of think that they both were born of the same father. Those two dreams, in the fact that the rockets and the bombs basically had a similar origin. It was just the fact that we decided that we would no longer engage in the adventure. We would engage in the tumult. And as a result, I realized that ambition to be the first child, to grow up and kind of walk on another planet, because again, the moon is a moon. It's it's an orbiting body, around the Earth. But to actually work, to actually stand on a planet, that was the new thing. So that was the feeling of betrayal, in the fact that my government, felt that its ambitions were more to kind of like, think about its own national interests, rather than the kind of desires of genius to kind of like follow its adventure. Now I remember kind of like seeing movies, and they talked about 1980s and the year 2000. You saw people in spacesuits, and they were kind of going to rockets, and then I saw a friend of mine who's younger than me. I think he's like 38, 39 years old. He said, in 1980s, we thought by 2025 the world would be this. I said, no, we thought that in 1970. We thought that in 1960. But we look at ourselves now and we think, my God, we've gone backwards. In fact, we have gone backwards in the fact that what we thought we could do and what we did in 1969 and 1970, 71, 72, we can't now. We can't stand on the surface of the moon. But the thing is, we've created the history that the opportunity could be there for someone else. And I talked about that last week. So anyway, at this point, the horizon of dreams for me as an architect, and I kind of somewhere between this and that, I kind of come across Frank Lloyd Wright, and he's the first name I hear as an architect. I kind of like think I remember hearing, aside from Leonardo, because I mean they said, oh, he was an architect, scientist, an artist, a painter, sculptor, and I kind of heard about Buckminster Fuller and Frank Lloyd Wright. Now I knew little about them because I was just kind of, wandering through life trying to find some kind of way to kind of avoid all these kind of responsibilities and obligations and try to find a way to get back to what I loved. But I think what happened was that, accidentally, being a very kind of uninspired student, I remember thinking to myself, at a certain point, people say, oh, it's time to go to college. I had no idea what college was. I thought college was just like regular school, that it was something that, thanks.
I heard you cough.
Oh, thanks. That you did because, you were obligated. You had to go to third grade. You had to go. And after 12th grade, I thought the next was college, and I didn't really understand it, even when I was there. So I remember, there was some discussion in the house. And again, it wasn't as if I understood this. And again, I, kind of part of the education was I had an interest in these things in terms of doing them for myself. But at a certain point, someone said, well, Bruce, what do you want to do? What do you want to study in college? And I didn't realize, because I thought, they gave you, you had curriculums in 4th and 5th and 12th grade. They'll just give you other stuff to do and they'll kind of have no interest in you. So, the idea, you'll never get freedom to kind of do what you want to do. You'll always constantly be told, you'll be obligated and have responsibilities. So for me, that idea of kind of pursuing that, so it was a really great thing to find out that there was a school of architecture. Now, the other thing was, being an incredibly poor student, I didn't realize colleges evaluated students in terms of their ability to learn. So the next thing is like kind of like, sorry, I'm still getting over this cold, was like you had to qualify to go there. But this, fortunately for me, I was given a situation where, because of my intelligence, innate intelligence, they were willing to give me an opportunity in a place that they didn't really figure I would last very long. But they said, whatever. So that would be for the next part. So what happens is I've kind of demonstrated how I kind of found myself through, my maestro, and kind of like started to see these things, and rocket ships and space planes. And for me, the realm of architecture was this big, everything, from cars to spaceships to, everything was the realm of the architect. The architect was a person who designed and kind of figured out everything. And so now the next phase will be architectural school. And from architectural school to being an architectural professor, to the point where I kind of like, and that'll be a kind of like, let's see, that's like a 15-year period. So this is like, say, from little boy to like, say, 17. So the first 17 years life. And then the next piece will be probably from 17 to like 35, maybe, and then basically that ends. And then the next will be the part after that. Maybe I should kind of do that next in 2 parts, but I think it's kind of like, we'll see. So that was basically that, the kind of like circumstance, the kind of like formulation, finding what I loved, finding why I loved it, that desire to kind of understand things, just kind of. And I spent a lot of time thinking, why did Leonardo want to understand everything? Because there had to be something that that drove him to that, because I know what draws me to it. It's fear. I figure if I can understand things, I'm not vulnerable, and I can avoid pain and suffering and death. I remember telling my mother when I was a little boy that I was going to be a doctor because I was gonna cure death. And she said, "Death isn't a disease." And she said, I said, "No, it is. I mean, people die. That's what it is." And I remember kind of thinking, because I figured if I could live forever, I could always kind of like draw and play and build blocks and kind of enjoy my life. So for me, eternal life was a desire because I always loved living, and I always loved being left to my own imagination to kind of like fulfill and satisfy myself. And I was fortunate enough to find a partner in Julie who had the same desire, and it's like all we want to do is be left alone to do what we love and do it together. I mean, that I think is the most, to me, that's the most beautiful thing, is that like the two of us just do the most beautiful eyes. My little, pee, pee.
Don't make any sudden moves. I'm really tired.
Okay, so that was this part. My God, this has been an hour already.
I know, it's been really interesting.
Oh, thanks, B. Thanks, B.
hearing-
All right, well, let me put my heavy book down. Mrs. Rosen isn't here, so I'll just kind of leave it there. But I mean,
She is always here with
she's always here. I always like to believe that Mrs. Rosen is still out there, that there's some boy like Bruce who's kind of coming into the library somewhere, and that Mrs. Rosen is kind of taking down the book and kind of like fire his imagination and kind of help him find those things that that kind of like kind of give him solace and satisfaction and hope, as those things did for me. So try to understand. That was what I wanted to do. That's what I still want to do. Try to understand everything, why things happen. So next week, it will be number 13, my recent past architecture, which is basically, I said, school, professorships, travels. And then after that'll be the aftermath, organic design thinking, which was kind of like so quick happen is like, this part, the world is this big. When I go to architecture school, it gets this big. And then when I get out of architectural school, I try to make it this big, and then I realize that's not going to happen. So I better pretty much go off on my own. So it's like in those three pieces, we go from this to this, and then back to this. So that middle period, kind of like was very restrictive, because I found as if like the scope of what we could attain, we could aspire to architecturally became very, very limited. But I felt that was the fault of architects, not the fault of imagination. So the realm of ideas is free to all, and it is to the benefit of all for us to keep it and maintain it this way. Thank you. We'll see you.